Great. We'll get started. My duty, privilege, and pleasure to have an opportunity to introduce Ken Hyland. Ken is another person who, of course, has come a long way, as David Rose. Maybe not quite as far as David, but pretty much from Hong Kong. Ken Hyland is Chair Professor of Applied Linguistics and Director of the Center for Applied English Studies at the University of Hong Kong. He's taught Applied Linguistics and EAP for over 30 years in Asia and Australasia, and was Chair of Applied Linguistics at the Institute of Education at the University of London before moving to Hong Kong. He's published over 160 articles and chapters and 19 books on language education and academic writing. Most recent publications are Disciplinary Identities, Cambridge University Press, 2012, Corpus Applications in Applied Linguistics, edited with Mike Hamford and Xiaoming Huat for Continuum, 2012, and Companion to Discourse Analysis, edited with Brian Paltridge for Continuum, 2011. He was the founding co-editor of the Journal of English for Academic Purposes with Liz Hamp-Lyons, and is now co-editor of Applied Linguistics. I'll just quickly say I think I have half of those 19 books on the shelves in my office, and I designed a fourth-year course last year and taught it called Writing and Knowledge Making in the Disciplines, and when I went to produce the reading list, I could have just filled it with Ken Hyland's work, and I included a lot, but of course had to include some other stuff. But what he's done is amazing. So over to Ken.
Thanks, Graham. You always get tech problems when you're most nervous. Thanks for coming. It's a sunny afternoon. I appreciate you being here. This is actually, this is not working. This is actually a very special occasion for me, and I feel quite daunted presenting to so many genre big shots who are here. People have influenced me over the years, and I feel very honoured and humbled to be invited along with them to this conference. I want to thank Graham, Natasha, and Jaffa for making this happen. As Jim said this morning, this is Language Day at the conference, and time to get down and dirty empirical. There have been a lot of very theoretical papers given from this platform over the last couple of days. But as we saw in Jim's presentation, language perspectives are always informed by theory. I'm going to take a different perspective to Jim and speak less about theory than he did, but I hope my talk helps to concretize some of the ideas in social constructivism and in the sociology of knowledge. I'm going to talk about community and identity and argue that genre, and particularly the ESP version of it, is a productive way of looking at both. I'm also going to be making some implicit claims about methodology, as it seems to be a major point of difference between the rhetorical and the textual orientations to genre. I think ESP version takes the most eclectic approach to methods of the three traditions. And while I do a lot of interviewing of students and faculty, today I want to focus on corpora and what it can tell us about context. I agree with Carolyn Miller's statement that she made in the Q&A after her presentation, that genres don't lie within corpora, but in their recognition by community members. But I wonder if this dichotomy is so great as we might suspect, because, of course, a corpus is just a body of knowledge, a body of evidence of how language is typically used in a given context. But we can see in corpora the expression of routine community practices. It's the it's these repeated patterns of language that reveal genre activity. And this both realizes and constructs communities. So that's where I'm coming from. Focusing on genre, focusing on the genres familiar to participants allows ESP to locate itself in the commonplace events of those working in academic settings. And this helps us, I think, to understand something of the practices and norms of particular communities, and to see how participants represent themselves using these community situated genres. So I'm going to look at the two most contested concepts in the social sciences. Let's begin with community. This is, of course, a troubled concept, but we can see it as the shorthand for the practices and discourses routinely used by a particular group. Now, it's particularly contentious when talking about disciplines. After all, this is a concept under fire from postmodernism, which sees the fragmentation of knowledge and the destruction of disciplinary coherence, and also undermined by institutional changes like the emergence of modular and practice-based degrees. Like most communities, disciplines changed constantly, if slowly. New disciplines like biotechnology and gerontology spring up at the intersections of existing ones and achieve international recognitions. Other disciplines like philology, perhaps, and astrology decline and disappear. So instability is inevitable in any community, and especially where the community is the sum of conversations that collect around particular social and epistemological practices. Discipline, then, is a term which helps us to join writers, texts, and readers together. It provides the context in which we learn to communicate and to interpret each other's talk. Now, genres are important in this context because they're the institutionally recognized ways of producing agreement. They're the oil which keep the disciplines running. Okay, all this is a bit abstract, so I'm going to ransack some of my earlier work for examples of how genres realize disciplines. First, let's think about how hedges index their context. Of course, hedges are devices which withhold complete commitment to a proposition. They imply that a claim is based on the writer's plausible reasoning rather than certain knowledge, and they indicate the degree of confidence that the writer thinks it might be wise to give a claim while opening a discursive space that allows readers to dispute interpretations. Now, because they represent the writer's direct involvement in a text, they're twice as common in the humanities and social sciences as they are in the hard sciences. So we find far more statements like this, very heavily hedged. Now, the fact that there's less control of variables, more diversity of research outcomes, fewer clear bases for accepting claims than in the social sciences means that writers can't report research with the same confidence of shared assumptions. Papers have to rely far more on recognizing alternative voices. So arguments have to be expressed more cautiously, using more hedges. At a deeper level, of course, there are disciplines like philosophy, literary criticism, cultural studies, where explicit reflection is a central analytical tenet. It's part of the core ideology of the discipline. In the hard sciences, on the other hand, positivist epistemologies mean that the authority of the individual is often subordinated to the authority of the text. Facts are meant to speak for themselves. So this means that writers often disguise their interpretive activities behind linguistic objectivity. They downplay their personal role to suggest that results would be the same whoever conducted the research. Less frequent use of hedges is one way of minimizing the researcher's role in the text, and so is the preference for modal verbs over cognitive verbs when hedging, because they don't collocate so often with author subjects. Scientists then tend to be concerned with generalizations rather than individuals. So greater weight is put on the methods, the procedures, the equipment used, rather than on the argument. So in other words, claims for the originality of research have to be balanced against the beliefs of readers, taking into account their likely objections, background knowledge, and rhetorical expectations. So we gain support, express collegiality, negotiate disagreement through linguistic choices which explicitly connect our texts with our disciplines. And modals then are one way of helping to reinforce a view of science as an impersonal, inductive enterprise, while allowing scientists to see themselves as discovering the truth rather than as constructing it. Another feature which displays disciplinary context in the research article genre is directives. Now, directives instruct readers to see things or to perform an action in a way determined by the writer. And they're largely expressed through imperatives like consider, note, imagine, and obligation modals, must, have to, ought to, and so on. And we can see them as directing readers to three main kinds of activity, to textual, physical, and cognitive. Textual acts direct readers to another part of the text or to another text altogether. There's some examples there. Physical acts direct readers how to carry out some action in the real world. The real world here is usually a research lab, so these kinds of directives are very heavy in the methodology sections of science research articles. And cognitive acts direct readers how to interpret an argument. So they explicitly position readers by encouraging them to note, consider, concede some argument in the text. So generally, explicit engagement is a feature of the soft disciplines, where writers are less able to rely on the explanatory value of accepted procedures. But directives are a potentially risky tactic because they instruct readers, they tell readers what they have to do, how to act or see things in a certain way. So because of this, most directives in the soft fields are textual. They direct readers to a reference or to a table rather than telling readers how they should interpret an argument. So examples like these are very common in the social sciences. Argument in hard knowledge disciplines, in contrast, is formulated in a highly standardized code. Succinctness is very, very highly valued by science journal editors who are overwhelmed with submissions and want to publish as much as they can, and by scientists themselves who are overwhelmed with all these journal articles and the information in them. As a result, we find a high proportion of cognitive directives here because they allow writers to cut directly to the heart of matters. The cognitive directives then explicitly lead readers through the argument, and we find lots of forms like this in the science articles. The last feature of academic genres I want to mention in particular are lexical bundles. These are simply frequently occurring word sequences. So they're a key way of shaping text meanings and contributing to our sense of naturalness and distinctiveness in a register. So collocations like as a result of and it should be noted that identify a text as belonging to an academic register, while in pursuance of and in accordance with help mark out a legal text. Now, looking at a corpus of 120 articles and 120 postgraduate dissertations, I found that the most common bundles in academic writing are these. A lot of concession-type talk in academic writing. Never pin your flag to the mast. of the four, but there's a lot of disciplinary variation. Of the four disciplines in the corpus, electrical engineering texts were the most dependent on bundles. They had the most bundles. It comprised the greatest proportion of words and had far more bundles than many bundles that were not found in the other disciplines. I'm not sure why this is really, but it could be something to do with the fact that technical communication is really relatively abstract and graphical. So language constructs an argument by linking data and findings in relatively routinely patterned ways, and so it relies on formulaic sequences far more, and for stylistic variation perhaps uses more of them. There are also considerable variations across disciplines in the four-word bundles themselves. So in fact, over half of all the items in the top 50 bundles in each discipline don't occur in the top 50 of any other discipline. The greatest similarities are between cognate fields. So business studies and applied linguistics share 18 bundles in the top 50 most frequent bundles. But these four are exclusive to those two fields. They don't occur in the science and engineering texts. Biology and engineering, similarly, have 16 bundles in common and also have 4 bundles which don't occur in the social science texts. There are also disciplinary variations in the functions of these sequences, with a broad split between research-oriented bundles, which refer to real-world activities, making up about half of all those in the sciences, and text-oriented bundles, focusing on the argument, comprising half of those in the social sciences. Not surprisingly, participant bundles, which focus on the writer or reader of the text, are twice as common in the more discursive fields. These uses reflect the distinctive argument patterns in the two domains. So these are text-oriented examples from the social science. These largely connect aspects of argument. Those in the sciences point to the research and findings. So these convey the kind of grounded, experimental basis of work in the natural sciences. Participant bundles, referring to the presence of the speaker or writer in the text, more explicitly, express a stance or modality of statements. And as I say, these are twice as common in the social sciences. So it's all very clear that I think writers in different disciplines represent themselves, their work, their readers in very different ways, with those in the humanities and social sciences taking a far more personal positions than those in science and engineering. So the rhetorical practices of each discipline don't just reflect an epistemology, but help construct that epistemology. There is no natural way or neutral way of reporting ideas or findings. There are only community-sanctioned ways of doing it. Now, because the ESP version of genre allows us to focus on community ways of negotiating meaning, it also tells us something about how writers understand their communities, what their readers are likely to find convincing and persuasive. So these repeated rhetorical decisions don't just construct communities, they also help construct individuals. Now, Benwell and Stokoe tell us that identity is the way that people display who they are to each other. So it doesn't exist within individuals, but between them, within social relations. So this is the mantra of the social sciences. This is identity as performance. But it's the identity it's the performance of a speaker or writer, I think, what they do through the text they engage in and the linguistic choices they make when they engage in them. So identity is something that we create through the ways that we participate in our everyday discourses. So while it might be a performance and subject to change, it's a performance which is reinscribed in us over time. It comprises dispositions to behave in certain ways and to make particular discourse choices in routine situations. Now, of course, academic reputations are based on saying something new, but it means saying something new in ways that are familiar to those that we're trying to convince. Effective argument means, too early. Effective argument means employing the community's collaborative practices. And this is why academic discourse is often seen as crushing users into conformity. But the conventions are also enabling. They're options which allow writers to engage in a community and perform an identity. So while academic genres restrict behaviour, they don't exclude agency. So in other words, identity is what makes us similar to and different from each other. For academics, it's how they both achieve credibility as insiders and reputations as individuals. Obviously, we're all different. Class, ethnicity, age, gender, all influence how we experience the world, how we make sense of our disciplines, how we interact with our colleagues in performing a professional identity. But when acting as academics, however, we're acting in a circumscribed context which gives meaning to our discoursal choices. We understand each other's talk in the context of that interpretive community. Now we can see something of what I'm talking about here in perhaps two genres where the assertion of self-representation is most explicit. The academic homepage and the bio. And I want to say a little bit about each of these now. Let's start with homepages. Identity partly involves identification. Identifying ourselves as belonging to a particular group by taking on its discourses and its understandings. What we do when we create a homepage is to present a self by selecting materials likely to be valued by a particular group. At the same time, however, we want to be seen as an individual within that group. For academics, then, the personal homepage is an identity claim. But there are tensions here because we're not just academics, hopefully. We're other things as well. Not all of us. And there's a great risk that our identities can be hijacked by our employers. This is what Toms and Thelwell said about this a few years ago, that the institution merely constructs academics in the model that is ideologically suited in order to promote the institution. Academics are thus denied any autonomous subjectivity construction and yield to the constructed display items in the university electronic window. So we are mannequins in the shop window of our universities. Now, to regain some control over their representations, academics create their own homepages. So I compared the differences in two versions of this genre. I looked at 100 homepages in philosophy and physics, 50 university-hosted and 50 individual pages by the same authors. I also took equal number of full professors and assistant professors and of men and women from each discipline. Now, obviously, visual representation is a key factor in constructing identity in homepages. And this is typical. This is a professor of physics at Harvard. Nothing unusual about this. This is a professor of philosophy at University College London. The most striking feature of these university homepages is their glossy uniformity. Design, format, colour, images are determined by the institution, and they're duplicated for every member in the department. And this repetition imposes a university branding on academics. So while located in different disciplines, different universities, different countries, these pages have a similar grid structure and narrow colour range. The pages are dominated by banner headings, which have institutional logos, the names of the department, the name of the university. Down the side, there are sidebars which give information about the department. Now, these features are symbols of ownership, which position the individual as an employee. Following left to right reading conventions, the text on the left is scanned first. It's the given in the text. So it provides the context which we read the academic, the author himself. So the institutional context is the point of departure for the representation of the academic's identity. Squeezed into the remaining space up here, subjects are presented through a brief paragraph, a few publications, and a photograph. Now, the photograph is normally a passport type photograph. If there's any background at all, it's an office. This minimization of context disconnects the subject from time and place. So the person becomes a generic academic filling a vacant place on the homepage. Now, when it's repeated across an entire department, these features construct the subject as just one academic among many, subjugating individuality to the institution. Hyperlinks are also important in this genre, helping to construct identity by association. So who we publicly connect with obviously says something about our interests, our communities, and how we want to be seen. Unsurprisingly, these pages are dominated by institutional links. So going back to the two pages I started with here, Berg and Martin, they had an identical 21 links, mainly to the university and the department, and only 3 between them, which were personal. Over the entire corpus, over 2/3 of the 700 links in the institutional homepages connected to institutional targets, just 11% to the individual. Now, because of this, academics attempt to reclaim some control over their identity representation through personal pages. And visually, these are generally more homespun and individual. They reject the institutional branding, which situates the academic as a commodity, and they convey integrity through a kind of minimalism and a DIY design. One way authors personalize their homepages is through more and more varied photographs. So there were 5 times more photographs in the personal pages than the university pages. And they often showed the subject in some leisure activity, fishing or whatever, or with friends. But 80% of the images didn't include the subject at all. They were of children, partners, landscapes, pets, collections of stamps or fluffy toys. They were. So the visual isn't just embellishing the text here, but playing a central role in presenting the self. Links are also different on the personal pages. I'm not sure if you can see this, but the blue bars represent the frequency of different themes in the university pages. The brown bars are the personal pages. When given a choice, authors reduce links to the university and the department, the first 2 bars there, quite dramatically. But links to publication, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th bar, shoot up. and most academics link to their PDFs or reference list. Disciplinary links, the third one, are also far more important here. So these take readers to labs, to research groups, journal sites, professional associations, and so on. So academics are trying to showcase themselves as academic individuals rather than as their institutions. However, when we look at how authors describe themselves, there's a far greater resemblance to the university pages. 80% of the pages mention jobs, research, and publications, and only 11 of the pages gave any personal information at all. For some, however, the personal page is an opportunity to present an academic self more creatively. This is Ian Howarth's page, and you probably can't read it, but the hyperlinks are in blue and underlined. Now, he constructs himself predominantly as an academic. So the first link, for example, it says you should probably be looking elsewhere, and the link takes you to his university page. The next two links are to his research groups in the department. The third paragraph has links to the Royal Astronomical Society and the astronomy picture of the day. But the photograph of the languid chimp, he mentions, tongue-in-cheek, his hometown celebrities. He also lists what he calls dweeb pastimes. Do you have the word dweeb in North America? Yeah. So he's a kind of over-studious, sort of socially inept sort of individual. But he's constructing himself as an academic, but a more humorous and richer academic than the university poster boy. But overall, despite some idiosyncratic designs and research links, most subjects limited their self-representation to an academic profile on the personal pages. But what does it matter? What's lost by this? Well, academics don't have to say anything more about themselves than they do already. But what is missing is often any sense of the author's individuality. By creating a homepage, subjects are choosing to participate in a medium with very strong expectations of personal disclosure. So other social media, Twitter, Facebook, are places where you give up your privacy. So the decision to present a professional face is a marked choice. Minimal disclosure suggests the bland academic that's presented there might be all there is. Let's move on to bios. The academic bio is another opportunity for academics to present a scholarly identity explicitly. It's a genre where in 50 to 100 words, academics present a narrative of expertise for themselves. It's particularly interesting because it sits in stark contrast to the article itself, which has been stripped of all identifying information for blind peer review. It's also interesting because that unlike other familiar methodologies in identity research, it doesn't produce self-conscious talk in a formal, low-stakes genre where you give your life story to some stranger from the local university. It provides an authentic way of getting at self-representation. So it's a site where academics stake a claim for a particular version of themselves, and they so indicate what writers see as important and valued by the community. Now, my corpus here comprised 600 bios. I did this with Polly Z, by the way, with 200 from each of leading journals in applied linguistics, electrical engineering, and philosophy. I also controlled for gender, with 100 bios written by males and females in each discipline, and by status or rank, using 4 categories from senior academics to technicians. Now, in my analysis, I looked at what people said about themselves and how they said it. So first of all, I identified what aspects of themselves writers included, because these show kinds of identities likely to be approved by peers. Now, the table shows that virtually everybody mentioned employment, and together with research interests, this comprised over half of all the acts in the corpus. Now, for junior academics, this is often all they've got to say about themselves. But professors obviously have a greater range of experiences to draw on in constructing a biographical identity, and we find an upward curve in the mention of research, employment, publication and achievements as we climb up the status ladder. Gender, though, seems relatively unimportant in identity construction in this context. What men and women said very similar things about themselves. It turns out, again, that discipline was the most important influence. The biggest disciplinary difference was the weight that engineers give to education. For them, this was typically linked to the area of study, what they actually studied. And you don't find this in the other disciplines I looked at. So it demonstrates a specific expertise and insider competence. I think it also reflects a kind of hard science apprenticeship model, where the education of PhD students is also an opportunity for them to research and to publish as part of a team. So perhaps their education is more central in their bios. Interestingly, we also found engineers giving more importance to personal information. Almost all the engineers in the corpus mentioned their birthplace, and often their year of birth. Didn't find that anywhere else either. Applied linguists crafted identities around their research interests. They make a claim for credibility through insider expertise. And research interest makes up about a third of all the acts in the applied linguists' bios. Philosophers, on the other hand, parade their publications. Very proud of them. Generally, though, these are monographs, and they involve a greater investment in time and effort, I think, than the multiply authored and frenetic output of the science articles. So presumably, they count more when constructing a self. Now, identity isn't only expressed in terms of what we talk about, but how we talk about it. And one way of getting at this is to borrow from systemic linguistics and focus on verbs or process types in the SFL vernacular. SFL recognizes a distinction essentially between mental and material processes. So mental processes are verbs relating to sensing, think, feel, believe. Material processes are concerned with doing, so work, write, study, teach. And a third important process is relational processes, and these express being. Now, these choices matter in identity performance. So, for example, she is interested in is a mental process. It constructs the author as an active, thinking being, exercising conscious choice in a research interest. Whereas her research interests are a relational process, is more impersonal, downplaying the author's choice to highlight something that belongs to her. Again, we can also see that acting in the world in some way, a material process, represents greater visibility than subjectively interpreting it through a mental process. Now, overall, writers used relational and material processes in 95% of all the clauses in the corpus. So they stress what they are and what they do. Now, this is because bios have something to say about who the author is, or how he or she wants to be seen. Interestingly, though, the table shows that relational forms increased with experience or rank, and material forms decreased. So there's a shift from seeing our activities as something we do to something that we are as we go through life, maybe. Scary. Relational processes are mainly intensive, where a writer claims to be something, like an assistant professor, a doctoral student. And these claims are strengthened by the use of identifying relational clauses over attributive clauses. And they're twice as frequent among professors. So professors say, is professor, she is the author, is the holder of 2 patents. So these choices give a definiteness and a uniqueness to what is being claimed. They identify the writer by signalling this is an important part of who they see themselves as. The bios of students and support staff, in contrast, use attributive options to signal class membership rather than a unique identity. So they're a member of a group rather than an individual. So status has some impact on identity representation, but once again, it isn't status or gender, but discipline, which is the major influence on choices. Applied linguists prefer mental types, representing themselves as thinking academics, rather than as intellectual workers grinding out a quota of papers and presentations. So it projects a distinctively intellectual identity. Engineers, in contrast, use more verbal forms to present themselves as arguers and talkers. So highlights agency, an active scholar. The biggest variations were in relational processes. And interestingly, philosophers used identifying relational clauses twice as frequently as linguists and 4 times more frequently than engineers. I'm not sure why, but explicitly naming yourself as something is key to identity. And this perhaps reflects the more individualistic ethos in philosophy. So here, research represents the creative insights of an individual author. And this is very different to the more humble scientific ideology of the sciences, which sees the results as a collective endeavour of a team using appropriate procedures. So while bios might seem a standardised genre with a limited range of options, there are variations in how writers use them to construct an academic identity. And these apparently bland descriptions are cross-cut by rank, by gender, and particularly by discipline. As I've said, identities are constructed out of the rhetorical options our communities make available. So we get credibility as members and approval for our performances by positioning ourselves in relation to others using these discourses. But at the same time, we ourselves are positioned by those discourses. So there's a tension here. So while we use genre conventions to index membership, claiming similarity, we gain reputations by taking a different stand or using a different set of genre options. Positionings are not all the same. I want to briefly take this up in the last few minutes by comparing the work of 2 applied linguistic celebrities with a larger corpus of work in the same 2 genres, research articles and books. I don't have time for much detail, but I want to show how Debbie Cameron and John Swales construct very different identities, both from each other and from the mainstream. First of all, then, Debbie Cameron. I'm not sure if you know her work, but she's a fairly well-known radical linguist. And if you do know her work, you'll be familiar with her very confident and assertive style. Now, one of the ways that she conveys this is through her significantly above-average use of is. This is the 5th most keyword in her corpus. This means it's statistically significantly overused compared with a much larger corpus. Now, this collocates most frequently with it is, 370 times, and particularly in the form it is plus adjective plus to infinitive. Now, thematic it, introducing an embedded clause as subject, asserts the writer's opinion and recruits the reader into it. This is a very directive strategy. It attempts to grab readers and take them along with the writer, as you can see from these examples. This assertiveness in Cameron's authorial positioning is also expressed through the co-occurrence of it with that, which occurs 250 times. Now, Polite and I have called this evaluative that. It works to thematize the writer's evaluation of the content that follows. So it's my own view that. What does not change is my conviction that. This is, in this context, is problematic that. So this is a powerful way of projecting ideas because it makes the writer's attitude the starting point of the message and the perspective from which we interpret what follows it. So while she rarely uses the first person, her use of is leaves us in no doubt about her opinion. Another way she uses community resources to construct a distinctive identity is through the use of rebuttal and counter-argument. So not occurs 904 times, but 572, and though 144. These are all in the top 20 keywords of her corpus. So she's using negation far more than is common in applied linguistics generally. And again, this is a very forceful expression of ideas, but instead of proclaiming a position, it disputes alternatives. So, for example, here, Cameron seems to go along with the reasonable policies of promoting a wider access to university, but then turns to question the underlying assumptions of that argument by presenting her own position, that knowledge work is actually training for employers. Now, John Swales is an altogether different kind of character. He projects the identity of a cautious and inquiring colleague rather than a combative advocate. And he does this through choices which convey clear personal and a strong interpersonal connection with readers. Now, John's frequent use of the first person is the most striking feature of his work. And in fact, I and my both occur in the top 10 keywords of his corpus. In fact, it occurs nearly twice as frequently in his corpus than it does in applied linguistics more generally, and far more commonly than in a wider range of academic papers. So we get a very strong sense of personal investment from John's writing. We see a writer making decisions, weighing evidence, drawing conclusions, as here. It's a very personal statement. And this is one more relevant to this conference. It's not true, he is obsessive compulsive about it. In fact, we find the first person in Swales' work is mainly associated with mitigation and attitude. The most frequent main verbs with I show a preference for caution, with think, believe, suspect, hope, tried, guess, among the most common. Now, this reflexivity contributes to an identifiable voice, and a key aspect of this voice is the frequency with which self-mention is used in a self-deprecatory way. This is an example. So he's publicly admitting the, and I think this one really speaks for itself. So there are he's still got time. So there are different ways we can use community resources. Okay, let me just wrap this up. The study of academic genres shows how we choose our words to connect with others and present our ideas in ways which make most sense to them. By privileging certain ways of making meanings, genres help to perpetuate the norms and thinking of disciplinary communities. And this also encourages the performance of certain kinds of professional identity. Now, this is certainly constraining because it creates a context which restricts what rhetorical habits we can bring from our past experiences, and influences those which we can use from those available in the community, in the repertoire from the community. But genres are the ways that we relate independent beliefs to shared experience. So their study shows us something of how, through our repeated choices from a repertoire of options, we display ourselves as the people that we want to be. So that the production of genres is always also the production of community and the production of self. Thanks for your attention. Thank you.